January 17, 1944. Mid-Atlantic 47 degrees N, 28 Esnbone or W. The sea was iron grey, churned by winter winds that clawed across 3,000 miles of open water. Beneath the surface, in the pressurized darkness 200 feet down, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hassler gripped the periscope housing of U-257 and listened to the rhythmic ping of sonar somewhere above. The sound was distant, methodical, a hunter's heartbeat. Around him, 42 men breathed recycled air thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and the metallic taste of fear. They had been submerged for 11 hours. The batteries were failing, the air was going sour, and somewhere in the black water above them, an American destroyer was waiting. This was the Atlantic in the fourth winter of the war, where Germany's undersea empire, the vast invisible armada of U-boats that had once brought Britain to the edge of starvation, was dying in silence. For 3 years, the Kriegsmarine had waged a campaign of technological terror across these waters, sending Allied tonnage to the bottom at a rate that threatened to sever the lifeline between America and Europe. German submariners called it the Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. British sailors called it the Devil's Passage. By 1942, over 6 million tons of Allied shipping lay scattered across the Atlantic floor, and Admiral Karl Dönitz's wolf packs ruled the convoy routes with near impunity. The submarines were Deutschland's secret weapon, the steel shadows that would starve England into submission and keep American power locked away on the far side of the ocean. But by January 1944, something had shifted. The hunters had become the hunted. The men aboard U-257 believed in the invincibility of their steel tube. They had been trained to trust the ocean's depth, the acoustic silence of their electric motors, the cunning of their commanders. German propaganda had told them they were the elite, the Unterseebooty crews who would win the war beneath the waves while the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht faltered on land. They expected to strike from invisibility, to vanish into the deep, to return to Lorient or Saint Nazaire with victory pennants streaming from their conning towers. They had been told the Allies were blind, that their detection technology was primitive, that German engineering would always stay one step ahead. What they experienced instead was the sound of their own extinction. On the surface, 3,000 yards away, the USS England, a Buckley-class destroyer escort barely 6 months old, cut through the swells with predatory precision. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, stood on the bridge with binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon where grey water met grey sky. Behind him, his executive officer monitored the sonar readout, watching the glowing trace that marked U-257's position with the certainty of a death sentence. The England displaced 1,400 tons. She carried 3 3-inch guns, depth charge racks, and a new weapon the Germans did not yet fully understand, the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that could rain 24 contact-fused projectiles onto a submerged target with devastating accuracy. Pendleton had been at sea for 19 days. In that time his ship had sunk 3 U-boats. He was hunting his 4th. The mathematics of this hunt were brutal and elegant. In 1942 the U-boats had the advantage. They struck at night, on the surface, using superior speed and tactical coordination to overwhelm convoys. But by 1944 the Atlantic had become a killing ground for submarines. The Allies had deployed long-range B-24 Liberators equipped with radar and depth charges, closing the mid-Atlantic air gap where U-boats once surfaced with impunity. Convoy escorts now traveled in hunter-killer groups, using high-frequency direction-finding equipment, HFDF, called Huff-Duff, to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions with lethal precision. Centimetric radar could detect a surfaced submarine's conning tower at 10 miles, even in fog or darkness. Sonar had evolved from a crude acoustic device into a refined tracking system capable of holding contact through evasive maneuvers, and the breaking of the German Enigma cipher meant that Allied commanders often knew where U-boat patrol lines would form before the submarines themselves received their orders. The invisible line was no longer invisible. German submariners still believed in their mission because they had no choice. They were told that new snorkel technology would allow them to run diesel engines while submerged, that improved torpedoes would restore their striking power, that the Type Tex-21 electroboats, fast, silent, deadly, were coming soon to change the war. They clung to these promises the way drowning men cling to debris. But the reality was mathematical and merciless. In 1943 alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 237 U-boats. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew had fallen to 2 patrols. Young men who left keel or breast with iron crosses on their chests were returning in body bags, or not returning at all. The Atlantic was swallowing Germany's sons at a rate that even Dönitz could not sustain. Aboard U-257, the sonar ping grew louder. Hassler gave the order to go deeper. The hull groaned as the submarine tilted downward, descending past her rated depth into water cold enough to crack welded seams. At 300 feet, the pressure was over 9 tons per square inch. Rivets wept, pipes shuddered. The men stood rigid at their stations, staring at the overhead where condensation dripped like slow rain. They could hear the destroyer now, not just the sonar, but the churning of her screws, the thrumming of her engines, the sound of machinery built in American shipyards working with the steady confidence of industrial supremacy. It was a sound they had learned to fear more than depth charges, the sound of abundance, of a nation that could build destroyers faster than Germany could build U-boats, that could replace every lost ship with two more, that waged war not with desperation but with overwhelming material certainty. The first Hedgehog salvo came at 14:23 hours. 24 projectiles arced through the air and plunged into the water in an elliptical pattern, sinking rapidly toward the submarine's calculated position. Unlike traditional depth charges, which exploded at a preset depth whether they hit anything or not, Hedgehog rounds only detonated on contact. This meant silence if the attack missed, and catastrophic violence if it succeeded. The men aboard U-257 heard nothing for 3 seconds, then the ocean erupted. 2 projectiles struck the forward hull near the torpedo room. The detonations were simultaneous, a paired thunderclap of high explosive that tore through steel plating designed to withstand pressure, not shaped charges. The bow section imploded instantly, flooding with seawater so fast that the 6 men in the torpedo compartment had no time to scream. The submarine's nose pitched downward. Emergency lights flickered. The chief engineer shouted into the intercom for damage reports that would never come. Hassler, gripping the periscope housing, knew they were dead. The mathematics were simple: a flooding bow, a submarine past crush depth, and a destroyer above that would not stop until the water was quiet. U-257 took 4 minutes to sink to the bottom, 2,300 feet down, where the pressure folded her hull like paper. 42 men died in the darkness, and the USS England marked her 4th kill. This was not an isolated incident. This was industrial warfare refined to a science. Between May 19 and May 30, 1944, the England would sink 6 Japanese submarines in the Pacific, a record unmatched by any other ship in naval history. But here, in the Atlantic, the pattern was already clear. American destroyer escorts, working in coordinated hunter-killer groups, were systematically dismantling the U-boat fleet with cold efficiency. They did not rely on luck or heroism. They relied on technology, training, and the inexhaustible output of American factories that could produce a destroyer escort in 3 months and train her crew in 6 weeks. The Germans had built their submarine strategy on the assumption that the Allies could not replace losses fast enough. That assumption was now killing them. The symbolic weight of the Hedgehog was not lost on those who understood its implications. It was a weapon that represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare, from area saturation to precision strike, from hoping you hit something to knowing you did. German submariners had once joked that depth charges were gifts from heaven, random, scattershot, survivable if you dove deep and stayed silent. But Hedgehog was different. It turned every attack into a binary outcome. You lived or you died, and the decision was made by mathematics, sonar calculations, and American engineering. There was no more hiding in the deep. There was no more luck. By the end of January 1944, the USS England had accounted for 4 U-boats in 8 days. Her crew did not celebrate. They refueled, rearmed, and returned to the patrol grid. The North Atlantic convoy routes continued their ceaseless march eastward, carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and the accumulated industrial weight of a democracy at full mobilization. Every Liberty ship that reached Liverpool or Murmansk was a statistical dagger in the heart of German strategy. Every U-boat that failed to return was a hole in Donitz's invisible line that could not be filled fast enough. In the officers' mess at U-boat headquarters in Paris, the maps began to tell a story that no one wanted to read. Red pins marked the last known positions of lost submarines, pins that now clustered in areas once considered safe. Casualty reports arrived daily, each one a bureaucratic acknowledgement that another 40 men had been crushed, drowned, or incinerated in the deep. The replacement crews grew younger, less experienced, more desperate. The propaganda still spoke of ultimate victory, of miracle weapons and turning tides, but the submariners themselves knew the truth. They whispered it in the bunkers at Lorient, in the bars at Brest, in the cramped crew quarters before they sailed. The Atlantic belonged to the Americans now. The transformation was ideological, as much as tactical. German submariners had been raised on the mythology of the lone wolf, the cunning predator who struck from the shadows and vanished into legend. They had believed that technological superiority and warrior spirit could overcome numerical disadvantage. They had trusted that their training, their discipline, their willingness to endure hardship would make them invincible. What they encountered instead was the grinding logic of industrial democracy, a system that did not value individual heroism over collective output, that treated warships as interchangeable units in a production line, that replaced losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. The Americans did not need their destroyers to be invisible. They needed them to be numerous, reliable, and good enough. And they were. The recurring sound that haunted the final year of the U-boat war was not the explosion of torpedoes or the roar of diesel engines. It was the sonar ping, steady, relentless, inescapable. That sound followed German submarines from the Bay of Biscay to the coast of Newfoundland, from the convoy routes to the patrol zones, from the surface to the crushing depths where steel hulls became tombs. It was the sound of being seen, of being tracked, of being known. It was the sound of a technological advantage that no amount of courage could overcome. And for the men who heard it in their final moments, it was the sound of an invisible line that had become all too visible, a line drawn not with ink on a map, but with sonar beams and radar pulses, and the cold certainty of American mathematics. By the end of the war, Germany would lose 783 of the 1,162 U-boats it commissioned, a casualty rate of 67%. Over 30,000 submariners would die in steel coffins beneath the waves, the highest loss rate of any military branch in any nation during World War II. The invisible line that was supposed to strangle Britain and keep America at bay had become a mass grave, a testament to the limits of tactical brilliance when confronted with strategic abundance. The USS England survived the war. She was decommissioned in 1945, sold for scrap in 1946, and melted down to make refrigerators and automobiles. Her Hedgehog launchers were removed and stored in naval warehouses. Her crew dispersed into civilian life, carrying with them the memory of 8 days in January, when they proved that invisibility was no defense against industry, that steel and silence could not overcome radar and abundance, that the wolf packs had been hunted to extinction by ships built faster than they could be sunk. The U-boats trusted their invisible line because it was all they had. They trusted depth and darkness and the vastness of the ocean because their entire strategy depended on it. But trust is not a tactic, and mythology is not armor. The Atlantic did not care about propaganda or ideology. It cared about tonnage and technology and the inexorable mathematics of industrial war. And in that cold arithmetic, the invisible line was always destined to fail, not because German submariners lacked courage, but because courage alone was never going to be enough. In the end, the war beneath the waves was won not by heroes, but by assembly lines, not by cunning, but by radar, not by the few, but by the many. The Germans trusted their invisible submarine line until it drowned them, and the lesson carved into the Atlantic floor in steel and bone was simple and absolute. In a war of attrition against a democracy mobilized for total war, invisibility is just another word for obsolescence. The sonar ping, once a hunter's tool, became a requiem, and the ocean, indifferent and vast, swallowed the mythology whole.